There was one question that I just thought I'd give a more general reference to. It was pointed out after lunch that in the first chapter that we read from the Middle Way on the Refutation, the analysis of self and no self, on page 85, that His Holiness devotes about half the page to referring to one of the most complicated topics in Gelugpa philosophy very briefly and giving you a taste of it, but not enough information to really figure it out. And I mean, I guess, like, that he's planting seeds rather than trying to bring the harvest home, in a sense, by doing that kind of thing. This idea of how exactly you distinguish between the two different types of Madhyamika, and how Tsongkhapa made an argument that this was a philosophical difference that was important. The material, I mean, if you want to read the original argument, you have to read it in volume 3 of the Great Treatise, and it's very difficult. And if you want to have like something that explains it it's still hard, but maybe at a place where you can get a foothold, then I would recommend chapter 8 of Introduction to Emptiness as the place to read that a few times. And I mean, it's difficult, but I mean, I tried to make it as an access point so that if you read that and started to see what was happening, then you could look at that in relationship to the actual argument, and you start to see what was going on. Okay, so as far as this afternoon, I'm going to be commenting on Treatise on the Middle Way, first verses 24, 8 to 9, which are on page 105 of the Middle Way, and that will turn out to be a somewhat extended commentary, much longer than His Holiness is. Actually, he doesn't say anything exactly on those two verses, and then I'll after that we'll go on to talk about 24:10, which is also on the same page in Middle Way, including both his reference to His Holiness's comments and also bringing in some material from the Great Treatise on the Stage of the Path to Enlightenment briefly. And then, when we get through that, we'll proceed to finish the rest of the verses in 24. But since His Holiness gives very little commentary on those remaining verses, we'll follow the commentary of J. Rinpoche in his Ocean of Reasoning. Okay, so the first part, commenting on 24, 8 to 9. Perhaps we should read them. The Buddha's teaching of the Dharma is based entirely on the two truths, the truth of worldly convention and the ultimate truth. Those who do not understand the distinction between the two truths do not understand the Buddha's profound teaching. As we were talking about in terms of like there being no beginning, that cyclicness existence is not beginningless, and that no one can attain or aspire to nirvana and so forth, Buddhists say the darndest things. They just do. And they, even when you think you've heard it all, then you hear another one like I did this morning. I was like, there's no beginningless cyclic existence? I took that as a given. So I'm going to tell you a few of the darndest things Buddhists say, just as examples. And then I'm going to tell you why this exactly relates to these verses, that the teaching relies upon the distinction between the two truths, and if you don't understand the distinction between the two truths, then you're constantly confused about why they're saying these strange things. Okay, so Bob, this is number one. I have a few of these. Bob Thurman was on NPR. You may have heard some of them, right? Bob Thurman was on Fresh Air on NPR, and Terry Gross said, "Wow, a new Buddhist scholar was coming on. I have a light bulb joke for you. How many Buddhists does it take to screw in a light bulb?" And Bob was like, hadn't heard it before, so he's like, "I don't know, how many, Terry?" And Terry said, 2, one to screw it in and one to not screw it in.
Actually, 4, one to both screw it in and not screw it in.
Well, see, you're very quick. You're very quick, and just like Bob's on the air, live radio, right? And he doesn't miss a beat. He just says, "Well, that's pretty good, Terry, but the important thing is to screw it in and not screw it in at the same time. It has to be the same Buddhist." Okay, that's it. That story is complete. All very clear. So now something a little different. There's a Zen koan, and I'm going to do it from memory since I don't have it in front of me, but it's one of the standard koan collections, probably a Blue Cliff Records. And a hermit appears and asks the assembled monks, when the ancients reached this, holding up his staff, why did they not remain there? And everyone, I don't know, what's he talking about? And then he said, because it has no power for guidance. That's it. For those, and then on the popular video that we show to Land of the Disappearing Buddha to teach, Buddhism in East Asia in the university, there's a very austere Zen master who asked by his Western journalists, who is Buddha? Who is the Buddha? And the Zen master says, well, for those who don't know, there is Buddha really, but for those who know, there is no Buddha really. And then we have Nagarjuna 25:19, who baffled us by saying that cyclic existence is not the slightest bit different from nirvana, and nirvana is not the slightest bit different from cyclic existence, 25:19. And then I'll just add one more. One of my teachers, Genlo Sangyatso, said, we were reading the Two Truths together, and not exactly in commentary on any particular thing, but on the topic in general. He said, if you want to know at the end of the season which potatoes to boil and eat and which ones to save and plant the next year, you don't ask a Buddhist philosopher. You ask a farmer. Okay. All right. Okay, so that's all very clear, I think. And anyway, it's certainly clear that Buddhists do say the darndest things, and they keep finding new ways to say these things. And what's interesting is that this all relates to 24. If you understand the distinction between the two truths, then all of this apparent nonsense seems like a very good way to say things rather than just a cryptic, mysterious way. That there's a lot of ways to say things that point a little deeper than the surface and by these kinds of unconventional elocutions. And so what I'm going to do here now is explain the two truths to you according to one system without mixing it with another system. And some of you already know the system of the two truths in Prasanga Madhyamaka, but I'm just going to go through it. So because it comes out of Tsongkhapa's commentary on Chandrakirti's commentary on these verses, which is very extensive. It becomes the basis for a long discussion. What are the two truths that we're supposed to know the distinction from according to Gelugpa? The ultimate truth refers to emptiness, the emptiness of inherent existence. And it isn't, as we were talking about the other day, that there's like some single unitary emptiness. You can say it refers to emptinesses, but all of these emptinesses are just emptinesses of inherent existence in regard to different things that you might be talking about, right? So there isn't any other thing. Like if you say nirvana is also an emptiness, then, or nirvana is also an ultimate truth, then you also have to understand it as a particular sort of emptiness in order to include it in that category, because ultimate truth refers to emptiness as the ultimate nature of each and every phenomenon that you can look at and point to. Okay? And then there are other things that exist besides emptiness. And and everything else that you can think of and know, and everything else that exists besides the class of emptinesses, is a conventional truth. Okay, so that's the way the Gelugpas start, is that they say that you have you can think of everything that exists, and the ones that are the emptinesses, the final way that things exist, that's ultimate truth, and everything else is conventional truth. Okay, so what is the basis of division of the two truths? What is it when you say two truths that's divided into two truths? Some people, of course, naturally think it's truths, and Gelugpas, are emphatic against that idea of saying that you divide truths into the two truths, because it seems to suggest that the conventional truth and the ultimate truth are somehow true in the same sense. And they're not true in the same sense. They're designated, they're labeled as truths, or we refer to them as truths, but in very different senses from very different points of view. Okay? So in traditional discourse, it's certainly made extremely clear that if you really want to talk about truth and untruth, that you have to say that the ultimate truth is the truth, and that it's not the only thing that exists in the whole universe, but when you want to say what's the truth of things, or what's the reality of things, you come to the ultimate truth, not to the conventional truth, right? And so in that sense, conventional truths are sometimes referred to as falsities, things that exist but don't exist as they appear, and so they're not in the category of truths. They're still called conventional truths, and we'll come to that in a second, why they would be called conventional truths, and they're not actually truths. The point is that you shouldn't think, oh, there are two truths. It means that there's two kinds of, that truth is subdivided into the conventional half and the ultimate half. Oh, that would be that you're laughing, but that's a very natural thing for people to think, of course. I mean, if they, right? And then, that's what most people would think. And then another thing people could think is that the two truths are two perspectives and two ways of looking at things. And to my mind, this isn't such a bad thing. In fact, it's not the official Gelugpa presentation, but as we're going to see, it's not unrelated to the official Gelugpa presentation. But it's important to understand that the basis of division, when you say the two truths, you're talking about the objects of a consciousness, not the two different kinds of consciousness. So it's like you can't say I have the ultimate truth consciousness that's going now, because all the consciousnesses are conventional truths, right? And also another reason is that when you say that these are two different perspectives, in the sense that some things exist conventionally and some things exist ultimately, and if that's what you mean by the two truths, then it turns out that everything that exists conventionally. and if the ultimate truth referred to those things that exist ultimately, then it would be an empty class, an empty set, right? So that's not the case. So, right, you have to say that sometimes Buddhists, many times Buddhists, and sometimes even Gelugpas will, in a rough way, say in terms of the two truths, when what they really mean is in terms of a conventional perspective and in terms of an ultimate perspective. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But, for the official technical thing is we think of these truths as objects or realities, things that exist, and that that there's one class of existing things that is the final mode of abiding of each and every object that we can think of, and there's other class of existing things which are not that, but are something else, all right, as all the conventional phenomena. Okay. So those are the couple things. We could go on, but those are a couple things that the basis of division into the two truths is not. So the official position consistently held in Gelugpa, that's one thing that makes Gelugpa a little bit simpler. If you stay within Gelugpas, they just have one official position, right? And you don't. And that is that the basis of the division is objects of knowledge. Now, objects of knowledge is coextensive with existence. In other words, you could perhaps they could just as well have said existence without doing any deep harm to the position. Whatever exists is an object of knowledge. Whatever is an object of knowledge is an existent. But they always say objects of knowledge are the basis of the division. And when you push on the question of why do you insist that it's objects of knowledge rather than existence, the idea is that, well, these are things that are to be known. It's in the sense that when you say objects of knowledge, the way that the Tibetan literally means objects of knowledge, but it can suggest in an implicit way, things to be known. And if you think of it as things to be known, then the implication is we should be knowing these, just as Nagarjuna says. So if we're fully awakened beings, then we know both of these, and not only know both of them, but we know them both simultaneously without getting them mixed up with one another. So that is there's a sort of, spiritual meaning more than a specifically philosophical meaning, since philosophically you could have said that existence are the basis of division, but you wouldn't get that sense of in leading us towards awakening. That's my understanding. Okay, so what's the relationship between these two truths? Well, on the one hand, one thing you can say about them is that they're, in the Gelugpa way, they're mutually exclusive. That is, if one thing is truth and one thing is falsity, one thing exists the way it appears and one thing doesn't exist the way it appears. One thing is deceptive and one thing is non-deceptive. And that's actually what they use. Deceptive, non-deceptive, A, not A. These are like mutually exclusive categories. So if something is an emptiness, it's not form, and if something is a form, it's not emptiness. That's what they say. Right? That's the idea. Well, how could it be? And I gave the reason earlier, one of the reasons. They have many, many reasons that are adduced to prove this, but I just gave one of them that's easy to understand this morning, that if literally in this strict way that conceptual thought makes sense of these things, that the form of this table, its shape and color, were emptiness, and I would be since I'm directly seeing with a non-conceptual eye consciousness the shape and color of the table, and I've been seeing things just like that, beginninglessly, then I should be all awakened, at some prior time, presumably, right? Because I've had this direct perception of emptiness for a long time. So there has to be some way of understanding what's going on in the relationship between the two truths when you say form is emptiness and emptiness is form, other than saying truth is falsity and falsity is truth. Why? Because we're constructing this system, by the way, at the conventional level. This is not Nagarjuna talk here. We're now into trying to say something that makes sense for us out and use that as a structure to interpret all these other cryptic sayings. Well, when you try to construct a philosophical reconstruction, to say, in the sense of what all this was about, in a sense that's what Tsongkhapa did. It's like then you have to make these distinctions and then hold them clearly and then interpret texts from India that were taking a different point of view, showing what the different point of view was, and so as to show that it's consistent with that, and that's what he did, and it all did it very convincingly, to my mind. So one thing that we know is that two truths are mutually exclusive. You can't really say of a single thing which the conceptual mind lights on and say of that thing that it is a common locus of that you know, you could say like this, but if I say the Kleenex, then I'm talking about a conventional truth, and if I say the emptiness of the Kleenex, then I'm talking about the ultimate truth. So that's kind of the trick behind the one where the guy holds up his staff, because he doesn't say what is this staff when they reach this. He doesn't say when they got to the staff. He just says when they reach this. Well, what did you think this was? Just because it was, you know, holding, maybe there's different ways of looking at what that is. Okay, so one way of thinking about the relationship is that these two things are a dichotomy. But the other important thing is to understand that they're always right there together. You don't have like free-floating, independently. You know, you'd think if they're a dichotomy that they would always be apart. But in fact, they're always right together. Unlike what we would imagine of, say, well, they talk about crows and owls, you know, as being, you know, not being able to live together. and emptiness and conventional truth and ultimate truth are not dichotomous in the sense that they can't abide together. They always abide together. There's nowhere else for them to abide. They can't abide independently. They exist, both of them are only dependently arisen, and they exist only in relationship to one another. Okay? So you have these two things that are completely contradictory, but they always exist right together in regard to each and everything that we can think of or point at. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, I find it interesting. So then it's like you start thinking about it's like, well, if I say this, you know, then we're seeing the shape and color of the Kleenex, but also emptiness is also right there with it. There's no other thing that it can be or place for it to go. It has to be like, you know, emptiness right here. So how many emptinesses are there? Well, as many mental objects as, you know, anything that we can think of, and subdividing or, you know, spinning out in all directions. There's like emptiness associated with every object that we can point to. The emptiness of the you know, when we think of a certain phenomenon and then we think of its emptiness being right there together, they're said to be one entity, exactly together as one entity, no chick, a single entity. And then they add, but different conceptual isolates, or dopatade, means that even though they're a single entity, that the conceptual mind gets at them in a different way. They're right there together, but in order to think of it, you have to come at it from a different angle and a route. But the entity and something, it's ngo chick, since there you could say in some sense, well, there's one entity, you know, but within it there's these two natures or these two aspects or something. Sometimes different ways of talking about it. Like in sometimes Tsongkhapa says that ngo chick, that is that there is the single ngo, which could be an entity or nature. And in this case we'll say entity, right? But then in another place he says, for each and every thing that you can think of from forms through omniscient consciousness, there are two ngos, that is two natures. But those ngos are always right there together as ngo chick, so he's using ngo as like slightly different sense. So with every single thing we can think of, there's like these two things locked together. They're not just like locked together like parts of a puzzle that are still apart but then put together. They're like, there's no, you can't physically separate and say, let's go in and cut the emptiness part off, right? How can you, you know, there's no part of any object that you can think of that isn't empty. Inside, outside, upside, downside, it's all, each of it is thoroughly pervaded by total emptiness. So then, do you see what I'm saying? It's not really like when we think of there's a part that's empty and the part that's conventional, that's very wrong. everything is empty through and through, not just on the inside. Like some of the examples, like the plant and tree, you'd think, oh, well, it's kind of solid on the outside, but it's hollow on the inside. Well, that, there's a purpose for that teaching. And the purpose is not to get you to think that things have some real existence on the surface, but they happen to be empty in some different part on the interior. Yes?
I think I'm very good. So,
Oh, you're lost. Okay.
what?
Okay. Well,
The day before yesterday.
since the day before yesterday. Well, is there something that you could say to...
Yeah. But this is my question. So, in order to understand them, we have to say that they're mutually exclusive. What is it?
Exclusive.
Exclusive. In order to understand them, but ultimately they are mutually dependent.
No, not exactly. You added in an ultimately there. We're not, what I tried to say, and I'll just repeat this, is that like this whole explanation is that I'm giving right now, the little strange sayings I did at the beginning flip and combine ultimate and conventional perspectives. But now what I'm doing is I'm going to explain to you the Gelugpa way of understanding the two truths, and then we can use that as a key to making sense out of the peculiar things that Buddhists say. So now when we're explaining the Gelugpa system of the two truths, all of our discourse and talk will be at the conventional level, including all of it. So I'm not saying anything like there's no cyclic existence or there's no nirvana. Everything I'm saying doesn't have any ultimate things, okay? So how does the ultimate truth exist? It exists conventionally. What's its relationship to the conventional truth? What's its relationship conventionally to the conventional truth, right? Because everything's in with the conventionally. So what's its relationship to conventional truth? It's one entity with the conventional truth. It's everywhere present where conventional truth is present. And there's some kind of conventional truth that we can say is present, in relationship to emptiness too. So, emptiness can't just be like abstractly existing, some independent, apart from something that is empty. It is a special kind of quality, so it's not all that you can say about it, that it is a certain quality. But one thing that it is a quality of something that's qualified. And so it exists together with that qualified thing. It's the quality of something of lacking any intrinsic nature. So it's together with something that lacks intrinsic nature because it's that quality of that thing. Okay. Okay. So relationship between the two truths is they're always right there together in a single entity, and the only way that you can parse them or begin to talk about the distinction between the two truths is in conceptual terms. To say like that we're understanding that when we think about what this is from the point of view of how it, whether it would be good to plant this in the field or use it to fix a car or for some other purpose, then that's one kind of question that we can ask, and one sort of thing we can think about it. It's like, how would this work conventionally? But if we ask of this, what is it really? What is its final nature? Then the mind is like going along a different pathway, and as it does, it finally comes to a different object, a different mental object in relationship to, we could say the same thing, but whether you say it's in relationship to X, say the Kleenex, you come to a different mental object when you say what is it really than you do when you say would this be good for fixing a car or not. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like you have two different ways of thinking about what's here, right? And each of them arrives at this like different aspect or nature within each thing that one can turn the mind to. She's struggling over there. Yeah, sorry.
Is it correct to observe that objects will have a final nature?
Yes. Yes. The thing, was that a question?
Yes.
Yes, things have a final nature, and this is important because it's by knowing the final nature of things that we can eradicate the delusion that's the root of our being bound in cyclic existence. So if there weren't some final nature of things that we could know with our mind, then you wouldn't think of like how will we say why do the Mahayana Sutras tell the Bodhisattvas to do all these difficult things in order to seek realization of emptiness if there weren't some final nature of things, right? So yeah, things have there's something that when the mind arrives at when you ask of something, what is it really? But it's not the sort of answer that we might hope. Some graspable, we want something that is graspable and, well, we want something like Brahman or a soul or God or spirit essence, I think. I mean, I know it's like everybody has like slightly different takes on this, but I think that's what we want. Something solid, not in the material sense, but in a deep, meaningful, permanent, eternal, real, graspable sense that will save us from our impermanence and missense, you know what I'm saying? And it's like, well, that we want to find the real thing in which we can take refuge in some sense, and there is a reality in which is the heart of the second jewel, is like in this final emptiness, but it's not a kind of positive, affirming, independently existent, thing that because we're thinking of that this thing that we're going to grasp hold of would be intrinsically real it would exist in and of itself. That's how and it can't. Nothing does. And it's just, in a sense, it's a way of talk. It's the way we understand that everything is devoid of what it is we're grasping after. It's the fact that it's the universal fact of there being nothing, no inner spiritual handle within that we can get a hold of, But it's more a matter of letting go of that effort to grab on. So I guess I got into this is like this point that I was trying to get to is that there's these two, what I was saying earlier, that you think of the two truths as two objects of knowledge and that we shouldn't think of them as two perspectives. But just as I've just explained, there are two different perspectives involved. There's a certain kind of mind for which ultimate truth is an object, and that's a mind that analyzes what are things really. And then there's a different kind of mind that for which conventional truths are objects of knowledge. And that is importantly not a mind which is knowing the final nature of reality. And that's the point of Genlo-san Gyatso's joke about not asking Madhyamaka philosophers which potatoes to plant, because when you hold this potato and you hold this potato and he's assuming the Madhyamaka philosopher is caricatured here as somebody who sees everything in terms of its ultimate nature, which of course isn't true. But like that's the idea, and it's like, well, this one's empty. This one's also empty, fully, completely empty all the way through and through. Oh, this one too. And so, what am I going to, and then you would be like, well, will this fix a car? Well, it's empty of inherent existence. What else do you know? Well, nothing from that point of view. That's what we got. All emptiness all the time from that point of view. And it's like, well, this is a problem, And so it's like emptiness, knowing the ultimate nature of things is the the way that we get out of cyclic existence. But we're not going to even get to that or get anything else going in terms of the path or life at all, even manage, in cyclic existence for a moment, unless we're able to make some distinctions at some other level, and say, how these things are when we don't ask of them the question, what is it really? So that's what Tsongkhapa is makes this argument and say, if you want to be able to understand how things exist ultimately, you have to use reasonings. And all those reasonings depend on making conventional distinctions. And those conventional distinctions won't hold up if everything is immediately and always reduced to emptiness. So you have to be able to have two ways of thinking and two ways of knowing and understanding things: a conventional approach and a one that asks some question about phenomena, is discriminating and analytical, but the question is not, what is this ultimately? And then you have to have, in order to get out of cyclic existence, you have to have this other mind that interrogates and penetrates and analyzes and gets down to the piercing into things by, saying, what are they really? And you have to then have both of those kinds of things operating and not let one get in the way of the other. Yes?
But if they are a single entity,
yes.
You could ask a Buddha which potato you can use, because the Buddha is the emptiness, but also the conventional truth.
That's true. There is an example, very good. There's an example of a person who, while directly non-dualistically seeing emptiness, could also answer any questions about our farm agricultural problems. But the point is that that's the only person. That's the, well, all the Buddhas, but those Buddhas would be the only persons. Even other very advanced beings, close to being Buddhas, would have to either be on the what are things really channel, or the how do things look conventionally channel. And they couldn't be like, and they could tell you about the potatoes, but not while they were looking at emptiness, right? Assuming that they had, that's assuming that they had bothered to learn about those distinctions. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like at the conventional level, there's lots of stuff that we could learn about, right? And so you have to figure out what kinds of things at the conventional level are going to be worthwhile learning in some way, directly or indirectly, to help the path. Because there's like so many things that there's like an infinite number of conventional things that we could apply our minds to. Yes?
You had asked earlier today if the Buddha is beyond concept, how does he or she conceptualize things?
Right.
But then you were just saying that Buddha can both operate on the ultimate and the conceptual.
But not conceptually. These things all directly non-dualist. These things all appear to the Buddhas. Like, for example, the thing is, right, Buddha is achintya, samgimikya, beyond inconceivable. So, the idea is that every one of Buddha's consciousnesses are omniscient, and none of them are conceptual. Why? Because I was like saying to somebody at lunch, pretty much every traditional Buddhist system that I've ever heard of understands that conceptual thought, it has a particular problem, which is that even whether it's accurate or inaccurate, it always has a mistaken dualistic quality to it, which is independent from the question of whether it's helpful or unhelpful or accurate or inaccurate. And so it still has this problem. And in this particular system, they don't see that as a reason to discard conceptual thought for us. Just because Buddha doesn't have it doesn't mean we don't need it. We do need it, and they would argue, look, that's why we see these stanzas in Nagarjuna about, look, the ultimate's not taught without relying on the conventional. Well, the conventional is going to involve, dualistic and conceptual differentiations. You're going to have to use words and thoughts in order to get access to the ultimate. But when you're fully awakened as a Buddha, then you're understand, you have no conceptual thought, and you see all phenomena simultaneously, non-dualistically, without getting them smooshed together, mixed up with one another, with every one of your consciousnesses. So your nose consciousness knows emptiness, and your nose consciousness knows, every one of your consciousnesses knows everything that there is directly and non-dualistically. That's the idea. Because you have no non-omniscient consciousnesses, and you have no mistaken consciousnesses. Any conceptual consciousness would be mistaken. That's the idea. Okay, good point. Okay, so that's the way I think about it. And then I think of this two channels or two wavelengths, two different ways of looking at things, and that there's can be distinctive objects that are there depending on how you look, but it's the same thing that you're looking at in some sense. So by same objects, I mean different mental objects are arrived at even when you look sort of at the same thing. By thing, I mean, the one entity, the ngo chick, right? So we can think of ordinary examples of how this is true, and to gain some, confidence that this would be the case, right? If we are wondering if the gong has sounded, and we try to sniff for it, not being Buddhas, we don't get any useful information. However, this doesn't, the failure to sniff out the gong sound doesn't mean that the gong has not sounded. That I'm totally unable to smell that gong. And yet, that failure to find the gong with my smelling consciousness doesn't refute that the gong may have indeed have sounded. It's just that you're using a reliable epistemic pathway, but one that's attuned to finding a different sort of object or not, depending on whether that sort of object is available. Do you follow? It's like similar. You can use and this. I guess Tsongkhapa, he uses this. He uses this example. I think he uses seeing and hearing, not smelling, but it's just, the same thing. You can think about you never see sounds no matter how closely you look. You can look really closely and you don't see sounds, and yet that doesn't except for Buddha, right? Buddha's always the exception, but you never see sounds no matter how closely you look, and so that doesn't refute sounds. All right, so it just means that sounds aren't the sort of thing that you find when you look. Okay, so the idea is that when we look for the final nature, when we say what is the book really, and that we tune into the ultimate nature epistemic pathway, and we arrive at emptiness, and there's no book appearing on that pathway, just emptiness. Okay, then that doesn't mean that there's no book. It just means that the book doesn't ultimately exist. If it ultimately existed as its own nature, then we would have found it when we went over to that pathway. But the fact that it doesn't appear when we ask what is it ultimately doesn't mean that it doesn't exist at all. It just means that it doesn't exist in such a way as to be found when we ask of it, what is its real and final nature. So things have a way of existing such that they are not their own final natures, and then they're therefore never found when you ask them, what are they really? But that doesn't intend to mean that they don't exist at all. It's just meaning that they don't have some self-sufficient nature, some independently existing or real nature. And if they did, then we would have come to that. And it's the failure to come to that, the absence of that we finally understand. That's understanding emptiness. Is that somewhat clear? Yeah. So that's that kind of stuff is an introduction to emptiness, if you want to explore, and maybe, I don't know, appearance and reality, some too. So then we have the terms say something about conventional truth and ultimate truth. Ultimate truth is truth as object of an ultimate mind, that means that it exists as it appears to a mind that tunes in to the ultimate nature of things. That's just basically what it means. There's not a lot to be derived there. But the term conventional truth is very much more complicated. In Tibetan, it's Gunzop Demba. In Sanskrit, it's Samvritti Satya. And let's just start with the Tibetan for a second. Gunzop Demba means, has the sense of being, it doesn't mean conventional truth. There's another word, Tanya Demba, which literally means conventional truth, and Tanya Demba is considered to be, it's synonymous and coextensive with conventional truth. But so Jeffrey doesn't like to translate Gunzop Demba as conventional truth, because there's really another word that means that. And really, Gunzop Demba, the word that they usually use for conventional truth, means something more like a fraudulent truth, or or something like really more, I mean literally fraudulent truth, but what that really means is a truth from the perspective of a defrauding mind, truth for a perspective of a deceiving mind. Jeffrey likes to, when he's playing around, calls it the jerk truth, truth for a jerk. That's what a jerk would take as a truth, right? So the idea is that the word that we're translating conventional in the Tibetan etymology of that word, the word conventional doesn't mean conventional at all. It more refers actually to the ignorant. This jerk is like the deluded, the ignorance, the ignorant conception of. So like if you had a deluded mind that took things to exist as they appear, then of course for your perspective, this would be a truth, because you would be such a kind of fool, Yeah. I think it's like fool's gold. There's gold and there's two kinds of gold. Gold and fool's gold. It's just like that, It's like, actually, I don't think those are two kinds of gold, right? It's like, oh, well, yeah, they're two kinds of rock, but they're not two kinds of gold. They sound like they're two kinds of gold, but you can say, oh, fool's gold, it's probably not really gold. Right? That's the idea. There's two kinds. So fool's gold exists and gold exists, but fool's gold isn't what it seems to be, right? It's like that. That's what fool's gold, I think, is very much like the way the gold for a fool. What a fool would take as gold. That's how the word actually works. But then it also has, when you go back to the Sanskrit, Samvritti Satya, it has both of these meanings, and it has a long, complicated history. And you can take Samvritti Satya, which the Tibetans chose to translate as, truth for a fool, truth for a jerk, truth for a deceiving, ignorant mind. But they could have translated that, taken that same word with a different etymology, and put it more into like Tanya Demba, or like conventional truth, because Samvritti has both the sense of being, it's sort of like, it just means something like all covering, literally. So all covering could be totally concealing, total fraud truth, or it could be like pervasive conventions of the world. Some people have suggested that the word samvritti actually goes back to samuti in Pali, and this has a sense of a business or transactional. And so some people say this is really a transactional truth, or a kind of truth that has to do with the mutual dependence of things, interactive truth or relational truth. And so you get all of these different translations. Some people call it relative truth, some people call it fraud truth, or jerk truth, or some conventional truth, and deceiver truth, and they're all correct. It's because they're all mining different layers of meaning that are there in the term. But in the Gelugpa way, it really, there's lots of different meanings philosophically that you can get out of the term. It doesn't change anything I said before about the fact that these things exist. They don't exist as they appear. I mean, this gives you the flavor of the word. It's layered with, on the one hand, having this sense that conventionally this is the way things work and exist. Like there's the idea that it means that truth that might not mean exist as it appears. It could also be taken just to mean truth in the sense of existing. So if you say a real thing in a sense, not of an ultimately real thing, but just an actual thing that exists. So if you say it's an actual thing that functions in an interdependent transactional way, you say that's what conventional truth means, then you have a totally different flavor that is considered non-contradictory in terms of its philosophical meaning, but just a different connotation from the other one where you focus on how they're false and deceptive. And when you read Tsongkhapa, he goes back and forth between these two and he layers them together. And he sees them like right there together. And sometimes he'll focus on one, sometimes he'll focus on another. It's very interesting. So he'll say something about how, you know, conventional truths exist, are things that are falsities that exist conventionally or something like that, where he's weaving together the sense that these things exist, they have some conventional legitimacy, and also they have this deceptive quality. And then when you go on to the later Gelugpa literature, they don't actually change the Tsongkhapa's philosophy, but they tend to downplay or push a little bit into the background this sense of that conventional truths are falsities. This is my personal view, not some other person's teaching. That there's like a tendency to just say, well, what we really want to emphasize is not the deceptiveness of the table, but the fact that the table exists in a reliable, knowable, conventional way. Oh, yeah, well, yeah, technically it's a false thing. But the important thing is that it exists and we can know it. Now, that is one way of reading Tsongkhapa. That is a layer of meaning that's really, really important for him. It's just that what's interesting is that he sort of keeps this sense of how we're being fooled by things. He doesn't let that slip out of view. Sometimes when later writers, you know, write their definitions of conventional truth, even though they're basing it on Tsongkhapa said, they'll just sort of, the word deceptive or false will kind of just drop out. Listen, it doesn't actually add any extra, doesn't eliminate anything by including it. You know, we're still talking about the same things. Of course, everybody understands they don't exist as they appear, so they just leave it out, right? And so then you get this sense that like you could lead through, you know, just marinating in Gelugpa textbooks and not looking at Tsongkhapa or Chandrakirti to having a sense that, oh, the world's okay just as it is. And that's that hat-like, horn-like thing I was talking about before. Yeah. Yeah. Of course, and people, Gelugpas themselves, you know, become aware of that and criticize themselves for it. I mean, you know, it's not as though this is something that you don't. But I think, anyway, sometimes you see people from other Dharma traditions who will say, well, Tsongkhapa is very great, but we really don't like those other people who came afterwards. And sometimes I've wondered if it's in part because for them, that deceptiveness of the conventional is really, really, really important. And they're not comfortable at all with the idea of that there could be reliable knowledge of conventionally existent things. But they want the idea of false. And Tsongkhapa has both. And the later people like push the one that's important to them in the background, and so they prefer Je Rinpoche to his successors. Like Mipam, I think, would be an example of somebody like that. Okay, so we'll say a little bit, almost getting toward the end of the two truths. One thing that is then important to recognize is that within the conventional level, we want to be able to make a distinction between things that, like mirages and echoes on the one hand, and like actual sounds and water oasis and mirage. Where, it's like, so the way you have to be able to differentiate somehow within the conventional truth in between ones that we can use for the things that they appear to be and others that we can't. And the way that Chandrakirti does this is, and Tsongkhapa follows, is to say, we're not going to say that there are real conventional truths and unreal conventional truths, because we don't want to say that there are any real conventional truths. Because if we say that there's real conventional truths, then this will have the force of the sense that there are some things that are real conventionally, like tables and chairs. And that's exactly what we're trying to get away from, is the idea, not just that there's nothing that is ultimately real, but that even at the conventional level, that there's no really existent essence or nature of things. It's not that just that an essence of things doesn't exist ultimately, an essence of things that would exist by way of its own power doesn't exist at all, doesn't even exist conventionally. And the force of the sense, a real conventional truth, carries the idea that there's some kind of conventional truths that the water, the oasis ones, not the mirage ones, right, that have a real nature conventionally. Okay, and they don't want to say that. So what they say instead is that you can divide conventional truths into those that are right in relationship to a worldly perspective and those that are wrong in relationship to a worldly perspective, but you can't say real and unreal conventional truth. And then, and this is in Chandrakirti, okay? And so then what are the ones that are, obviously the mirage and so forth. So the idea is that you differentiate on the basis of whether there's some superficial impairment to the sense faculties. So, an echo has certain circumstances that cause our sense faculties, cause a false appearance to our sense faculties. And when there's some circumstances, internal, external, or both, that cause a superficial impairment, that is an adventitious, temporary, impairment, not like the root of cyclic existence kind of impairment, not like everything appearing inherently existent, even though it's not impairment, but just some sort of like circumstance, like that gives rise to an ephemeral, temporary, a deceptive appearance. Taking too much of, like, they give an example of taking something like Jimson weed, I don't know exactly what it is, datura, it's some kind of hallucinogenic plant. If you take this hallucinogenic plant, then your perceptions will be discredited by those of a person whose faculties have not been impaired superficially by taking this hallucinogenic plant. And this has to do with right and wrong in relationship to a worldly perspective, not what's ultimately real and not real. Okay? All right. So all these things, just to repeat something I said this morning, all of these things are empty, ultimate truth, conventional truth, all empty. All these things only exist conventionally. Ultimate truth only exists conventionally. Ultimate truth doesn't exist ultimately. Why? Because nothing exists ultimately, because when you ask of anything, including emptiness, what is it really, you don't find any graspable nature. It's very important that emptiness is empty. Emptiness is empty of having its own emptiness essence that's at the core of its emptiness, where we find that emptiness exists by way of its own nature. If it did, then it wouldn't need conventional phenomena to exist, right? And it would also, people understand it, just like negate or cancel out and supersede and override everything conventional. Conventional phenomena are in a sense able to exist and arise because they're empty, because they're not absolutely empty. They're not empty by way of some essence or some real emptiness. That's the way people think. So anyway, we talked about that a little bit before. The emptiness of emptiness is sort of the first saying that things are empty and then not reifying the emptiness. Those are the, I would say, precious philosophical moves that Buddhism, the teaching, the Dharma makes to open up a path for liberation. So anyway, if you understand those things, then you can understand the light bulb joke. Because, it's like, well, ultimately, we can't ever screw in a light bulb, we just can't ever be enlightened. It's nothing, there's no light bulb, there's ultimately no screwer in of the light bulb or socket and so forth, ultimately, right? But conventionally there is, and probably needs to be done. And so to be able to do it both be screwing it in and not screwing it in at the same time would be the idea of, in a sense, applying it to the context of the Bodhisattva path. I mean, you're bringing this understanding of emptiness into the if you're giving people, if you're practicing a generosity, of protecting them from tripping by screwing in the light bulb, and you're motivated by a wish to help all sentient beings attain to enlightenment, and you're realizing the emptiness of the light bulb and the socket and yourself as the screwer inner of the socket, and the emptiness of all the beings who will be benefit by you screwing it in, then you're practicing the perfection of giving as you screw in the light bulb. And you're able to do this only because you're both screwing it in and not screwing it in. Right? That's the idea. No, but it's not it's like this with everything. Do you see what I'm saying? If you understand this pattern, it's not like Buddhists have some other pattern. It's not like they have some other truths that you haven't heard about yet. Didn't he say, the Buddhist teachings rely upon these two truths. So once you see how this works in terms of one system, then even if you can see, even in Zen koans, for example, where they don't have the Gelugpa system, but they're going back to the same sutras that they were, and so the underlying way of thinking is the same, and so they become intelligible in a different way when you understand this thing clearly, right? So when the ancients reached this, why didn't they stay there? Because it has no power for guidance. Well, when you reach this, that is the ta-ta-ta, the suchness, or the just as it isness of how anything that one can point at, or like this, how it actually is. When you arrive at that, you've arrived at something which doesn't help you know which potato to plant, or anything like that, how to help people. At that time, you only emptiness, only that final reality of things is appearing. And so you don't remain there. That would be like Buddha just saying, oh, this is so cool, realizing nirvana under the tree, forget about everybody else. No, you have to get up and go out, and when you do, you're under the influence of under the influence of seeing things as they are. You're under the influence of wisdom. But you're doing it like you're having to go out and see conventional phenomena and say, well, yeah, all these things are empty, but one of them would be better to fix the car than the other. Yeah, and not ultimately, but right now, yeah.
One of the ideas, I think it was Erickson, talking about the Buddha being able to speak in the language of demons and whatever language is suitable, knowing that conventional.
Exactly. Right. Well, yeah. There's Arya Deva has a thing in the 400 about that you have to, when you go with the barbarians, you have to speak in the barbarians' tongue. And so to me, there's lots of ways you could just say, well, that's Buddha talking to us, and Buddha never uttered a syllable, from the point of Buddha's internal mental landscape formulating conceptualizations. But these speech acts spontaneously appear as compassionate manifestations, and they're attuned spontaneously and compassionately to our way of understanding. And what's our way of understanding things is dualistic and linguistically mediated dualistic conceptual concepts, because that's where we are. And people can't just say, well, let's stop thinking, and that because Buddha didn't think, and then be free. And well, some people maybe think that they can do that, but then they're thinking. It's really hard to just get, so then you can go into a meditative trance and temporarily suppress dualistic conceptions, but then it just comes back because the roots and seeds are Still there, yeah. Somebody, you have a question, yeah.
So there's conditional knowing and there's non-dualistic knowing or awareness and then emptiness. Are the non-dualistic and the emptiness paired or?
Not necessarily, but in the case of what the things I was just saying, they are. But like, let's see. When I was saying non-dualistic can mean a lot of things, so it's kind of a vague term. But what I was thinking in that sense is that when you have a conceptual thought, there's a coarse kind of error that's part of all of our conceptual thoughts, which is that there's a taking of an internal representation of the object as the object and using it to serve as the object. That's how Tibetan, not Tibetan, Indian Buddhist psychology thinks of thought. That it's always, even when it's right, it has a dualistic and mistaken quality because it's mixing together an internal representation with that's one kind of dualism. And if you just say, that's in this particular case, that's what I was referring to. It can mean a lot of other things. In this particular case, I'm saying, Buddha doesn't have any thoughts. It doesn't have any conceptual thoughts. And so there's just direct perception, yogic direct perception. All of the sense faculties have this yogic capacities to know all phenomena. So they don't know them by thinking about them or thinking about what to do. And so Buddha doesn't think about what to say that would be helpful or which language would be good to speak to us in. Something spontaneously manifests. Yeah.
Beings that have non-dualistic perception like Buddha?
Yes. Well, we can have, in the sense of the dualism of conceptual thought, you can say that our sense consciousness, as our direct perception, there's a different kind of dualism involved, but not the dualism of, an internally mediated representation. You can sort of directly get at the object. There's still a dualistic sense of subject-object duality and a dualistic sense that there's a thing that inherently exists here apart from me inherently existing there. But there's a kind of certain, in the way, just in the simple meaning of dualistic I was using before, there's a directness to the way we perceive things with our senses, right? And that thought is mediated by this internal representation. And that's the specific point that I was getting at. Unfortunately, the language of dualism and non-dualism is so complicated because there's so many kinds of non-dualism. But in this case, the idea is simply making is that Buddhists don't have any thoughts. They just directly perceive everything, including all. And now, in terms of directly perceiving emptiness, without non-dualistically perceiving emptiness, other beings besides Buddha, yes, that's what it means to be an Arya or a noble being. So the path is a series of stages that leads up to directly non-dualistically seeing emptiness and beginning to eradicate the afflictions from their root, eliminating from their root. But it doesn't happen all at once. And so there's a long process. Because if you follow highest yoga tantra path, it'll be faster. But the idea is that you have a long process, even in the sutra system, for gradually eliminating these afflictions by continuously going into and then out of this direct meditation on emptiness. So there'd be a lot, what he would say, there'd be anybody who has realized nirvana, so that include, foe destroyers and Arya Bodhisattvas, anybody who counts as a noble being would be a being who has had a direct non-dualistic perception of emptiness at some point, not necessarily at that moment. Yeah, there's a lot of things to get straight, huh? Yeah.
Don't you think that it's beautiful in a way, in that when you understand that things from a conventional and an ultimate sense, there's a beauty in that. Do you see that?
Yes. That's why I keep talking about it.
Because occasionally I find myself thinking about that the glass is already broken, and that really de-stresses your life in a way. You understand the things that is in a conventional way. But you have to understand that it's already broken. And when you do that, then you become a person that people like to be with.
The glass is already broken in the sense that it doesn't have a nature of being able to persist. Is your point? Yeah. It's true. That's right. It can transform how we see things. Yeah. Anyway, so all those other little things, strange Buddhist things, are just like that. They all come to make sense when you realize that they're, well, jokes, work through juxtaposition of two different perspectives, right? And then you're like, oh, that sounds weird. Oh, I get it, And it's like, and then that's like the the guy who inadvertently made the two truths joke about Buddhists don't know who they are, but they're sure they used to be somebody else. That's an accidental example of a perfect two truths joke, right? Because he played with the two perspectives and collapsed them in a way that created this like aha feeling, right? Yeah. Right. Okay. Okay. So that is my commentary on 24:8-9. We've tried to understand the two truths with the idea that this is the basis of the Buddha's teaching. And so now I have to find what it was. Oh yeah, 24:10. Without a basis in the conventional truth, this is 24:10 on page 105, the truth of the ultimate cannot be taught. Without a basis in the conventional truth, the truth of the ultimate cannot be taught. I made a reference to that a minute ago. It's like this barbarian language thing that we're talking about. Buddha, you have to use the conventional to learn about and understand the ultimate. Without understanding the ultimate truth, nirvana will not be attained. Now, this idea that to become free, we have to know the ultimate truth, but we can't just get up and know it, just change, like it's changing the channel on the radio or something like that. We have to first use conventional truth to understand this, and on the basis of understanding the conventional truth, attain nirvana. Now, in my idea, part of my idea of giving a commentary on this was to tell you how much it reminded me of this verse from the Samadhi Raja Sutra, which is in my way, my theory, which is that that in some sense, for the insight section of Lamrim Chenmo, for Tsongkha's great treatise on the stage of the path, the insight section, there's an implicit root text. Like I was saying the other day, even when people aren't writing commentaries, that because the commentarial model is in their heads, that they may implicitly have a root text, even when they don't tell you what it is. And I think that Tsongkha's root text for the insight section of his book, the second 2/3 of the third volume of the book, is this passage from the King of Concentration Sutra, because he cites it at the beginning he cites it in the Serenity section, and then he cites it both at the beginning and the end of the insight section. The same passage, right? And so it sort of brackets the whole presentation. It's on one of the places it appears is on page 108 in volume 3, where he says, if you analytically discern the lack of self in phenomena, one, and if you cultivate that analysis in meditation, then this will cause the result, the attainment of nirvana, and there is no peace through any other means. So I don't, know when the King of Concentration Sutra, Samadhi Raja Sutra, appeared in this world, and whether Nagarjuna had access to it at that time or not. But to me, just having that that passage fixed in my mind, I made a connection to this because, and certainly I think Tsongkhapa would make a connection to this, is that other people could read it differently. But from his point of view, this is what he's trying to say, is that you first have, given that, okay, what is the barbarian language that we speak? It's dualistic conceptual thought, where we're struggling to understand emptiness before we can meditate on emptiness, right? And this is, so first, with a basis in conventional truth, that means using conventional truths to do analysis that discerns the lack of self and phenomena. That's how, with a basis in conventional truth, you're making conventional distinctions and analyzing, using those conventional distinctions, what is the real nature of things. You can't, my point is like if you give an argument about like myself can't be inherently different from my aggregates, because if it were, then all my mind and body could be here and my real self could be over in the cow. Okay, so, well, or you give an argument that like lighting a match isn't going to fill the room with darkness, and therefore, you know, things that are inherently other can't be related as cause and effect. Or you give an argument about fire and fuel and fire. Nagarjuna has a whole chapter on fuel and fire and how they're interdependently related. Well, if you don't know about fuel and fire and cows and matches and butter lamps and darkness, then how are you going to reason? All these reasonings work on the basis of people having some practical experience at the ordinary conventional level. And Tsongkhapa says this in Lamrim Chemo. He says, all of these, you know, all of this related to John's question about the priority of these different sources of knowledge the other day. It's true, you know, we inference, reasoning, analysis is powerful and crucial to this process, but it needs data, and it just can't generate that data like a priori. We have to have some experience in the world with things and knowing how they are, and then we reason about that on the basis of that, right? And so you take this information that you have, do analysis on it at the conventional level, not, you know, and you say, how these things work, and then as you do, those conventionally reasons about like cows being different horses and how fire and fuel relate, they lead you to see that ultimately there's this internal contradiction and the idea of things both being related and yet intrinsically existent. They can't really be related and able to exist independently without being related at the same time. That being by nature related and unrelated are contradictory, and the whole idea of that just persists all the time in the way we see things and think of things is self-negating. But you only arrive at that by doing this analysis and at the conventional level, okay, and then leading into an ultimate understanding. So without a basis in the conventional truth, the truth of the ultimate cannot be taught, and without understanding the ultimate truth, nirvana will not be attained. So if you want to, you know, first, you know, understand the ultimate truth and then be able to meditate on it, you have to start with these conventional distinctions. And then, you know, it's the way the King of Concentration Sutra says, it's not enough to just do this analysis and say, oh yeah, I see that things are empty. When you finally see that things are empty, you have to then cultivate that analysis in meditation. So it's not you just like say, well, let's start doing some meditation. No, you first have to use conventional distinctions to do an analysis and realize the lack of self and phenomena, and then on that basis cultivate that particular understanding, cultivate very deeply in meditation, right? And that's what leads to nirvana. So that is the short version in 4 lines, the 4-line version of the insight section. That's it, really. I mean, you could leave out the Svatantrika Prasangika business because that's not covered in this. But really, that's what he's saying. That's his argument. He's found a sutra that says what point that he's trying to make just perfectly. Yeah. It's true. We want Buddhas are have non-dualistic, non-conceptual insight into emptiness. All Arya beings have that. As we were just saying, everybody who's related to nirvana has that. We don't have that. That's not how we operate. So how do you get from here to there? Clearly, meditation has to be involved. Some kind of analysis, perhaps, will come into it. And the question is, how do these work in relationship to each other, right? And Tsongkhapa's way of telling this story is that it's not a matter of using meditation to withdraw from dualistic thought from the get-go. It's the matter of first getting things very clear at the conventional and conceptual level, and then when you have that clear conceptual, say, understanding of emptiness, then you take that as the basis on which to cultivate meditation so that you have a very calm, clear, stable mind that focuses on emptiness and gradually, weans away, or thinking of it as sort of thins out that kind of aspect of dualistic appearance that we have, to the point where you penetrate the object, which in this case is emptiness, and know it directly. And that's nirvana. Yes, Cheryl?
I had a question about in terms of really knowing how things exist and work together conventionally.
Mm-hmm.
That I was thinking and wondering that maybe doing a lot of meditation on the tentative imagination,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of can get you to the point of knowing how things function.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that might really
No, it's the best.
starting point.
No, it is the best. Tsongkhapa says that. Lama Yeshe says that, right? And everybody, all the good people in between, Right, yeah. It's like this sounds also complicated, right? And so people go, what am I supposed to do? And it's like, Lama Yeshe said, well, you're going around looking at stuff and just keep reminding yourself that these things are dependent arisings and thinking about how they're dependent arisings. So thinking about their causes and conditions or parts, and then and if you can, think about how they exist in terms of our perspective, or framework, constituting them in that way. But you just start by just thinking, people had to come and put that screw in the wall there, so that, it's like each thing that around is it's not the meditation hall probably doesn't appear that way to you guys now because you actually saw it, but it's some things, if you come to some impressive building, right, and it just looks as in the case of a mountain, it appears to be naturally there. Of course, the mountain isn't a naturally objectively there either, but it's but to start with, as a building just appears to be independently there from its own side and very easily can be thought about. It's well, God, it really does look to me like it's just set up there from its own side, and when I look at it, it's very impressive. And it seems to be, it has this impressive buildingness quality that's just coming off of it, and impressing my mind from its own side, It's a new, amazing edifice, the Museum of Tsongkhapa in Spokane, or whatever, and it's, it's wow. In Ratnavali, we're eventually getting around to reading the Precious Garland. I hope it's or some of it. And Nagarjuna tells the king, he said, you should build Dharma institutions that amaze everyone. So he doesn't want the king to be endowing any ordinary Dharma institution. He wants something like that. Wow, where people look at that Dharma place and they go, the king who built that must have been so great, That's the sort of pitch. People will remember you if you really lay it on, and build some really impressive Dharma center, right? And so that's when you see something that has that quality of capturing your mind. It's it's attracts your mind or impresses your mind or repels your mind in some way. It's catches your attention. Then, okay, so we're not necessarily saying you're going to try to steal the building, or you know what I'm saying? But there's sometimes well, let's look at that. It's not like I'm intending some misdeed here, but there's a way in which there's some sort of sense of this as having some natural attractiveness that's appearing. you know what I'm saying? And it's sort of like, or the other way around. It's like, we won't name any particular people, right? But today, but you know what I'm talking about. It's like it's like that. You know, it's like, oh, the causes and conditions operating here. Yeah, it's not just like that. There's some natural, and it's that. I'm just taking this all from. I mean, this is just all in the tradition, and Lama Yeshe says it in Introduction to Tantra, because people can't like always have done all of this, but they can think about dependent arising. Okay, so now that's my insight into 2410. And but what does His Holiness say about 2410? He does have a commentary here on page 105 to 107, and he uses this verse as the context to introduce the distinction between conventional truths that are right in relationship to a worldly perspective and those that are wrong in relationship to a worldly perspective, which I already alluded to. And then he goes on to say that for something, what it means for something to be conventionally existent, which is not exactly what I was talking about now. I was talking about, what are those phenomena that are conventional truths? A different question is, what does it mean for something to be conventionally existent? Well, for something to be conventionally existent turns out to be the same as for something to be existent, because there isn't anything that's ultimately existent. So it's like, what does it mean for something to be conventionally existent? And as I was saying, I think yesterday, Tsongkhapa has this really interesting way, and it's based on Chandrakirti, of laying that out, and to say, start with what's known to the world as part of the world's conventions. Chikten Takpa. It's like renowned to the conventions that are renowned to the world, and then falsify or cross off those that are invalidated by one type of reliable knowledge or the other. And actually, this is the way. This is not the way you find exactly it done in Svatantrika Madhyamaka texts. And then there could be a question of whether their way is, bad or not. And some people say it is. But anyway, the way that it's done in Chandrakirti, which Tsongkhapa follows in Lamrim Chemo, is to use this process of falsification, or you have what people say, and then what within that is counterindicated or harmed, it literally, by reliable, unimpaired sensory faculties, right, or unimpaired inferential faculties. Like I could have a think that I've inferred the existence of God, like a lot of people have argued that they have inferred the existence of God from order that they perceive in the world, our design argument, right? So a lot of people actually quite forcefully feel that they've inferred the existence of a divine architect of the universe, right? So there's a reasoning, and it's perceived by some people as being a conclusive and definitive reasoning. And so then, from this point of view, that would be considered like, well, a false inference, something that appears to be an inference to the person who holds it in their mind, but there's a fallacy that's hidden within it, whereby it doesn't actually work, right? And so people can have sense consciousnesses that they think are correct. Like some of you might, if you remember having taken a bunch of Jimson weed, you might have some suspicion about different hallucinations that you see. But on the other hand, if somebody slipped it to you and you didn't know, then maybe you don't really know, whether you might think that what you're perceiving is real, and it's not. So you don't always it's like there are nonetheless, whether people at any given moment know whether whether they are, under a misapprehension that they're having reliable knowledge or not. we can say that there is like the reliable knowledge and not reliable knowledge. And the process of figuring out which is ongoing struggle, right, as we talked about the other day. But that idea, there's an ongoing struggle to try to sort out what's reliable knowledge. And it's not that there's no such thing. It's just that there's, some people think they have it when they don't, and right? And it fits with this model. That's why one of the things I like about this model is that it allows for this process of falsification, discrediting something that seems to be so. And His Holiness's way of explaining this is kind of interesting to me because when he explains this at the bottom of 106 and 107, he says, well, we can say that's the truth because I've seen it. Not only did I see it, but I carefully examined it, and I made sure that what I thought was accurate. And when we see something and carefully examine it and believe it to be true, then a second person comes along and verifies it, then that can be said to be real in a conventional sense. So he's thinking that he's positing this idea of multiple, what do you call that in the scientific method when you have,
Multiple variables?
not multiple variables. Replicability. Yeah, it's like replicability. That the idea that, somebody else in a different lab can do the same thing. And if not, then there's some, or you can do it again 50 different times with different people coming to watch, but it has to be something that's like not just some hidden idiosyncratic factor, like a lot of people have claimed to produce cold fusion. And then it always turns out that they didn't really produce cold fusion, but they seem to have really believed that they did at the time, right? So I think that this idea of a second person coming along and checking, you don't actually find that in Tsongkhapa's text, but it's not inconsistent with his text. You know what I'm saying? And it's completely consistent with what he said. It's just that he didn't specifically talk about the second person. And then one of the things about the whole second person business is how does that work when you're investigating states of consciousness? Because that's one. If your idea of what replicability means, reliability, inter experimenter reliability, or something like that. If your idea of that is based on materialist assumptions about what's real and what's subject to investigation, then you certainly have a problem talking about a subjective state. And it's like, can you check my subjective state? Unless you have a teacher who can clairvoyantly ascertain your subjective state, then all you can do is you can investigate the observable correlates of different states. If people do these practices, then we see that their bodies and minds, either observed with machinery or observed just with an intelligent person's perspective, change in such and such a way. And then when other people do it, the same sorts of things happen to them. You know what I'm saying? But you without clairvoyance, then there's no way to go in and have the kind of reliability or replicability that the material, what we think of as scientists are requiring. And so this is what Alan Wallace talks about all the time. This is his thing that, right? We should. Okay, so let's then let's see how much time we have. Yeah, we have 20 minutes. So let's. When His Holiness doesn't say a lot about the remaining verses, and so I thought I would see what Tsongkhapa had said about them. And so starting at 11, and in the Ocean of Reasoning, it's on 2411, is on page 498. By a misperception of emptiness, a person of little intelligence is destroyed. This is the same, just slightly different translations. Like a snake incorrectly seized or a spell incorrectly cast. Right? So there's some real power in this, and danger, is implied, and that if you don't properly handle or understand the idea of emptiness and take it to mean that things have a real essence, and that essence is this vacuity, then you will understand this real essence of that's a negation. Emptiness is a negation, and if they have that their truly existent essence is this negation, then you'll understand all these things as being destroyed. And that's the way Tsongkhapa interprets it. That if these people are these Buddhist realists that he's concerned with, they think everything, if something exists, then it's real. So if emptiness is now posited as the nature of things, then of course there's a real emptiness that these crazy Madhyamikas are positing as the nature of everything. If there's a real emptiness that's the nature of everything, then you've destroyed the three jewels, Four Noble Truths, the path, and everything else. Everything's been emptied out by this real emptiness that you've insisted on, like positing as the way things actually are. That's the way he comments on it, and he gives various sutra quotes and so forth. And then maybe let's skip over to 24:14. This is also then a famous verse. Let's see. Jimba did, for whom emptiness is tenable, for him everything becomes tenable. For whom emptiness is untenable, for him everything becomes untenable. And Jay and Nawan Samden did, for him to whom emptiness makes sense, everything makes sense. For him to whom emptiness does not make sense, nothing makes sense. And having read the Sanskrit, it's like they're both this equally correct, I would say, ways of reading that. So what I thought about that, I mean, you can understand that this is what Nagarjuna is saying as the conclusion of his discussion about the two truths and the proper way to understand emptiness, is that everything that the Buddhist realist has been saying is wrong with the Madhyamika position is actually wrong with the other person's position. That failing to understand that things are empty is what's going to prevent the three jewels and the Four Noble Truths from being workable, right? And that's, in a sense, the rest of the chapter plays out that idea. But so then what occurred to me when I was reading this is this idea that that emptiness, this idea that everything makes sense or everything works, everything's tenable, everything will work if you understand three jewels will work, the Four Noble Truths will work. Things can work is the sense that this is what lets things. It's the meaning of dependent arising. Emptiness is the meaning of dependent arising. So this makes possible the working of the world at the conventional level, right? It's not ultimately, or just but this is what makes possible the working of the world, is that things are empty. It lets things flow. So I just say this in relation to this problem of emptiness being a seeming depressing, and it's I think, well, if it just means that everything's free to be what it is and it's all connected to everything else, then why did Buddha give it such a depressing name? That was certainly, how could that be skillful, right? And it's not something that anybody else has made up. I mean, it means shunya means empty, and people say that at some point this came to be understood in relationship to the idea of the zero. Although the latest thing I've read about that is that even though there was an idea of zero in India and it was linked to this word shunya, it hadn't been linked to the word shunya at the time that Nagarjuna was writing. But it came to be linked to this idea of the zero. So that's not that's by definition non-positive, right? Yes, yes. So, but it's not a happy. It's not a happy zero, right? Is that what you're thinking? It's and so then in Tibetan they didn't improve the situation, and they translated it as emptiness. And dong means emptiness, and ni means dong means empty, and ni means ness. Or people say vacuity or voidness. I mean, it's the same thing. That's a word. Right? Emptiness. So why? Okay, so we say one thing it's very important, because if you just say fullness or interconnectedness or just like, some kind of like, I don't know, global networkedness. You know what I'm saying? It's like something like that. Meta interconnectedness. Like, you know what I'm saying? We're just all so connected that we're flowing in and outside of each other, and it's also, and it's like, well, the problem with that is that people could be more enthused by such an idea, but it doesn't get at the root of the problem, which is they think that any kind of connectedness or lack of connectedness or effectiveness or lack of effectiveness that anything has is on account of some exaggerated sort of reality that it has. Since the basic problem that we have is not our failure to recognize that things can be related. Our basic failure is to think that things are related because they have some intrinsic reality which we've laid it onto the top of them. In addition, on top, we've proliferated and elaborated on top of their actual simple suchness or thusness. Because we have this, the root of the delusion, that's the root of needless misery, is not a nihilistic one. Although there are, other that sort comes along. But the root is in the other side. It's a distortion that grasps at an exaggerated sort of reality. So, Buddha was, and this is always in the teachings, it's like, well, you don't necessarily go down easily, but that can be the case of the best medicine, right? It can go against the grain of what people would like to hear, but be ultimately the wholesome or salutary thing that they need to hear. That's like, I don't know, I just keep remembering reading this idea of pratiloma and anuloma. It's like that we say against the grain and with the grain, right? And in Sanskrit they say that with the way the hair grows is this, like that, and the way that, again, and then you pull it, champagne, real pain, right? Like that. So there's this way and that way, and it's like that, It's like, so Buddha's teaching goes against the way, pulling against the way that we want to go. Against the way we want to be pulled. We want to be pulled toward Brahman, the real self, and then there's something that's pulling the other way. Yeah, but okay. So that's the answer to the question of why there's such a bummer word for ultimate reality. And then the reason that we should be happy about it, Sopa. Let us rejoice that everything is empty, because that's what liberates us and makes it possible for everything to work. It makes it possible for everything to work, and makes us possible. Therefore, that's what makes the path possible. It's what makes virtue possible. It's what makes liberation possible. Everything that's good, all change is possible only because things don't have an essential nature of being in the screwed up way that they are. That's really important, right? And so it's like, oh, the emptiness of bars on the prison door. I thought I was in a prison that was properly locked, but I'm in the prison of cyclic existence. Actually has one of those doors that opens inward, and I was pushing out. And it's possible to go out. So it's like the emptiness is the emptiness of a lock on the door. The lock would be an intrinsic reality that makes it, impossible to get out. I think, yeah, a little more time. So 24.15, when you foist on us all your errors, you were like a man who has mounted his horse and has forgotten that very horse. He's speaking to the person who's attributed the first 6 verses to. And the way Tsongkhapa, I was thinking, it's like, I understand the general idea here, but what does exactly this horse stand for? And Tsongkhapa says, having mounted a horse that's characterized by dependent arising and emptiness of essential existence, and due to attention, not having noticed that, you're charging us with errors, you know. You're saying, like, you stole my horse, or something like that. You Buddhists are stealing my horse, and you're only sitting on the horse while you're saying that. That's it. Something like that. Then 16, if you regard all things as existing in virtue of their essence, then you will regard all things as being without causes and conditions. What's interesting here, worth noting in passing as we go along, is that this is a stanza where Tsongkhapa spells it out. You don't have to put any like ultimately's or reallys in to make sense out of it. He puts in the word, you know. If you regard all things, he doesn't say if you regard all things as existing, then you've messed up. He says if you regard all things as existing in virtue of their essence. So this is an important point, you know, when Tsongkhapa gets accused by some people of misidentifying the object of negation by constantly adding these qualifying adverbs in all over the place. And one of his points is like, well, if you look at the sutras, Buddha sometimes glosses himself in saying, when I say that things are not arising, I mean they're not arising intrinsically. And here you have Nagarjuna glossing himself and saying, like, look, what I've been talking about is things not arising in virtue of some essence of their own. It's intended to allow dependent arising to work, and that's why I told you that the same meaning as dependent arising. Right? And then the sort of climactic verse maybe of the whole book is that which is dependent origination is explained to be emptiness. That, being a dependent designation, is itself the middle way. And so in Tsongkhapa's commentary, I mean, I read this a lot of times and I could never figure out exactly, I mean, there's nothing wrong with this translation. That's what it says. But what is the second that when it says that, being a dependent designation, does it refer to the unity of dependent origination and emptiness, or does it refer to emptiness, or does it refer to dependent origination? And anyway, Tsongkhapa says it refers to emptiness in his commentary. So emptiness is a dependent designation. Emptiness is that which is dependent arising is explained as emptiness. That emptiness is itself a dependent designation and is itself the middle way. That's how I see Tsongkhapa reading it. And then he gives a number of sutra passages which back up this idea. The Anavatapta Sutra says, whatever is arisen from conditions is unarisen. It does not have the essence of arising. So there's showing that it's like emptiness is not intended to cancel out dependent arising. It's like means that things don't have an essence, which if they did have such an essence, it would prevent dependent arising. And then there's other sutra quotes along the same line. For example, one says, Mahayana Sutra says, all phenomena are empty, that is, in virtue of being essenceless. And it's like, well, you gotta pull those things out and write them down when you see them, because a lot of those Perfection of Wisdom sutras will leave out that little explanatory phrase. Right? And so it seems like Tsongkhapa did exactly that. You know, he found these things and brought them to our attention so that we could see that he wasn't just some realist who was afraid of emptiness and making up some sort of thing that that the Buddha didn't teach. Yeah. He says in this sutra, the teacher interprets his own intention, explains to us what he meant when he said that things are not arisen. Okay, let me see how much time I have. Yeah. So then, toward the end of this section, he has the discussion about what exactly do we mean when we say that dependent origination and emptiness have the same meaning. Dependent origination would seem to be a conventional phenomenon, not an emptiness itself, and emptiness is an ultimate phenomenon. And dependent origination is sort of, well, it's the condition of things being conditioned. We don't think of it as an unconditioned phenomenon, whereas emptiness is an unconditioned phenomenon. There's a lot of other things and ways in which they're different, it's sort of like that. You could say this is another version of the form is emptiness problem. If you're saying this thing that's on the conventional level and you're identifying it with another thing that's the ultimate level, then you need to have some, to make it work with the Gelugpa system, you have to some way of understanding or glossing that to understand what it means. And that had certainly come to Tsongkhapa's attention. I think I translated a text called The 8 Difficult Points, which I sent a portion of it to Venerable Chodron. It's not published, but it's a Gelugpa text where Tsongkhapa was giving a lecture, and then Kedrup was writing down, taking notes, and then this is published as a book, and I guess it's sometimes it's in both the collected works of Kedrup and the collected works of Tsongkhapa, because it's like it's Kedrup's in-person eyewitness representation of a teaching, rather than his own something he wrote. But then on the other hand, it's not something that Tsongkhapa himself authored in the usual way. So anyway, in that book, Tsongkhapa goes through some points that differentiate, in his view, the Prasangika view from non-Prasangika view, 8 points. And then after he's gone through the 8 points, he just goes on and talks about some other stuff, and which wasn't in the table of contents at the beginning that he was going to talk about. And I think it's very much like, so you have to remember, this is like a lecture, right? And so it doesn't say it in the text, but like reading, I feel like somebody asked a question. And there were a couple questions actually, and I think, and then he, Kedrup took notes on what Tsongkhapa said in response to these questions, and Tsongkhapa set out to give a lecture on the 8 difficult points, and people wanted to know about something else. They weren't interested in those points, and so they wanted to know about nirvana maybe or something. No, what they wanted to know about was, what does this mean when we say dependent arising and emptiness? What does that mean when we say that they're the same thing? And so anyway, without saying that I fully penetrated all of this, I thought I'd just share with you some of what he says. If you think that this means something like saying like that which is bulbous is posited as the meaning of pot, that there's like a definition of pot, and then there's a pot, and these two are the meaning, that when one ascertains through a particular cognitive process that effects have risen from causes, dependent arising, that one should thereby ascertain through that same cognitive process the meaning of emptiness, then this doesn't make any sense, because everybody who'd realized that there was operative causation would be realizing emptiness very readily. It's just like a different word for the same thing. Well, that's what it means to have the same meaning. Saying you could think that, right? But it can't possibly be that. And then he goes on to, eliminate in a short version here some other possible meanings. In the 8 difficult points, he has a whole list of things that it might be taken to mean and doesn't mean. But we don't maintain any of that. Well, what do we say? To take the meaning of emptiness as dependent arising refers to those Madhyamikas who have, through authoritative cognition, refuted things having essential existence. In other words, to really understand the meaning of saying that dependent arising has the same meaning of emptiness, you have to realize emptiness appears to be the same. So when these Madhyamikas ascertain that internal and external things are dependently arisen, in virtue of their dependence on causes, as a consequence of that very cognitive process, they ascertain the emptiness of things. The way I understand this is it seems to be saying that if you've realized emptiness and then it comes to your mind that, oh, this building arose in dependence on causes and conditions, that immediately carries with it the same force of remembering that the building is empty. because you've already realized emptiness. Anything that reminds you about any sort of dependent arising immediately reminds you about emptiness, and you don't see them as anything different. But that wouldn't be true for us because we hadn't made that connection. But once you make the connection, they have the same force, and one immediately brings the other to mind. Okay, and so then when you're thinking, one of the things that I thought when I read this is, well, that doesn't really help those who hasn't realized emptiness yet, because it's like we wouldn't really understand how dependent arising is related to emptiness until we've already realized emptiness. But how are we going to realize it? And so, I mean, I don't know that he 100% answers this question, but I would say that he doesn't back away from the idea that we should be using dependent arising as a reasoning to help realize emptiness. In fact, that's the very next thing he says. The person who has cultivated an ascertainment of emptiness, which is the negation of essential existence, and does through meditating on dependent arising, having seen, heard, and remembered that such things as barley and sprouts are dependent on causes and conditions, that should then practice the contemplation of the fact that they are, for that reason, essenceless. And then if you meditate on things are empty because they are dependent arisings, because they arise on causes and conditions in such and such a way, then what will happen? By doing so, in future lives, then when you hear about the doctrine of dependent origination, the latent potential for understanding emptiness will be activated. And then he gives an example from Sutra where somebody realizes emptiness without being taught emptiness, just through an explanation of dependent arising. And he said, well, that's because they've already meditated on the connection between emptiness and dependent arising in a past lifetime. Okay. I can take one question. I have to stop there because I don't want to just drag. It's not a... well, I'll just say the last sentence. So the last thing that he says about this is that essenceless or emptiness is what is the middle way, and that this point in 2418 is the same point that's made at the end of Nagarjuna's refutation of objections, which I mentioned doesn't begin with an homage to the Buddha, or any homage, but it ends with an homage to the Buddha. And it says there, and Tsongkhapa quotes it here, saying, I prostrate to the Buddha who is unparalleled and who has given the supreme teaching that emptiness, dependent origination, and the middle path have the same meaning. In other words, Nagarjuna himself, in his appendix to this book, identified this verse as the heart of the message of the book, and that for which he's prostrate, that teaching for which he's prostrating himself to the Buddha. This is in, you have this book? Yeah, Ocean of Reasoning, page 505, right in the middle. That's the end of his commentary, Tsongkhapa's commentary on 2418. So we've almost, but not, there are a lot of verses left in 24, but we don't have a lot of commentary left, just a very small amount of things to say. So I think that tomorrow, after we finish that up, or whatever else I think of to do, we'll then try to look at whatever verses we have left over from the middle way that I picked out, and then we have to start to say something about Ratnavali, Precious Garland, and you have a handout that relates to that. Okay, so that is the time. Thank you so much for your attention. Yeah.